This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News, and this afternoon I'm with Julian Lyon of the Residents for Guildford and Villages Party, and we are in the Holy Trinity Centre, and I'd like to thank the organisers of this centre for allowing us to use it. Julian, you're part of the Residents for Guildford and Villages Party. What is your role with them?
So in December last year, I announced that I was going to stand as an independent candidate for the local election in May. And at that time, there was no independent grouping other than the three councillors on Guildford Borough Council. And we set up a meeting in January with a number of other like-minded people to sell the idea of independent candidates for Guildford with their own views grouped by a number of common themes: openness and transparency, some concerns with local plan and so on and so forth. And in that process, we identified a number of people who were going to stand. I stepped back from that, but that was really the birth of R4GV. I've stayed close to it and involved with it, but not standing.
But what is the difference between R4 and other political parties?
I think the main difference is partly in the way that it was conceived. It's not a single issue party, and we were very keen for it not to be. It's a broad set of people who have had some misgivings about the way that the council has run in the past, the lack of transparency, the lack of inclusivity. A number of the community groups, like the Guildford Societies and so on, who felt that they didn't get enough of a voice. Something of a dictatorship in our minds that we really wanted to overthrow. And we felt that part of the rationale behind that was the national party system that guided these parties in the way that they operated, and that gave them a team badge, like a Manchester City versus Liverpool type badge, when if you're in the second division or third division, that doesn't really account for much.
So, Julian, can you tell me a bit about your community and political activity in Guildford, in summary?
Yeah, so I started getting involved with the music and arts in Guildford, and I was a trustee of South East Music Trust. I got involved with the Guildford Society and Guildford Vision Group, campaigning for the town centre regeneration. And in amongst those, I stood as an independent candidate in 2007. Didn't get in at that time.
Right. But you've also been involved in GVG and the Guildford Society? Yeah,
so I was chair of the Guildford Society, partly as a result of being in GVG and my involvement there. With GVG, I was there at or around the beginning of GVG in 2012.
Okay, and we ought to say that GVG stands for the Guildford Vision Group.
Indeed.
Okay. Now, going back to to R4GV, there have been questions about how it was funded. Can you answer those questions?
Yeah, so I don't know precisely the detail of this because I wasn't in control of that process, but there was a Just Giving page that was launched, and I, along with a number of other people, made contributions through that Just Giving page. I think you might need to ask somebody else for greater detail.
Okay, so your role with the party is as a policy advisor?
Yes, I'm one of a number of people advising in that. The way the party was originally set up, we didn't set it up with a chairman. We have a leader. The leader's Joss Bigmore, and now we need to address the back office operation.
Okay. Now, one of the questions I think has been asked in several areas of the borough is, why did your party only put up 17 candidates at the recent election?
I think the interesting question on that is, how do we manage to find 17 candidates in the first place? And in part, that was a sign of great unrest. We did have a number of other people who expressed an interest to stand, including myself, and for various reasons they didn't. But it's worth saying that at the rate that we polled, another 6 or 7 candidates would have given R4GV and GGG control of the council.
Yes, and can you just say why you decided to stand down?
So I'm a director of Savills. My day job is advising corporates on their commercial portfolios around the world. I have very little influence or anything to do with the development side of Savills. But after I announced my standing, my candidacy, there were a few tweets that came from the leader's office that suggested that any conversation he was having with Savills implied that I had some involvement. And furthermore, that if Savills was involved in anything to do with the council, it might be about Savills and not about the issue that they were involved with. And I felt that for myself, for Savills, for Guildford Borough Council, it was the appropriate thing to stand back.
Okay. And that's when we talk about the leader, we're talking about the former leader, Paul Spooner?
Yes.
Okay. And now, how did the party select the wards that they stood in? What was the criteria? Presumably you went for the ones you thought you had the best chance in, or was that the only criteria?
Well, I think if you look across the piece, in the main, it was standing against Conservative councillors. So we fielded one for our in St Nicholas, there was one Conservative councillor there. We fielded one in Onslow, there was one Conservative councillor there. It wasn't a deliberate attempt, it was kind of rationing the resources there, mostly putting people where they lived, but it was looking at some tactic in that regard as well.
Okay. And what do you think people were voting, the ones that voted for you, what do you think what was their motivation?
I think they really wanted to see a different consensual type of politics. They've read in your pages and elsewhere and seen the results of divisive top-down politics. And I think they felt that actually the candidates that we fielded had good personal and professional credibility and would be able to understand the issues well and represent them in that forum. I'm not sure they necessarily expected us to do as well as we did, and perhaps we didn't as well.
Yes, it did appear that way, I must admit, at the count. But and it is going to be a challenge for your new elected councillors to, they're a steep learning curve to face, haven't they?
Yes, they do. And the interesting thing about public service in this way is that you have to stay true to your principles and to your heart. And the way that R4GV is set up is perfectly suitable for that kind of approach. There isn't a sense that R4GV has decided this, therefore everybody's got to get behind it. We have a lot of people with community and social involvement who will be great councillors, great advocates for their ward residents and the rest of the borough.
Why do you think that most of the Conservatives voted to support Caroline Reeves as opposed to Jos Bigmore?
I think you'd have to ask them that, but in my own mind, I think it's voting for the establishment versus a disruption. We all know that disruption's quite attractive these days for people in the street, but it's quite something to be feared if you're in a position of tradition. I think the first thing to say is they probably voted because they didn't like the local plan and they didn't like the way it was done. And so let's pick those two apart, because I think that there is some question over whether it was valid and appropriate to seek to adopt the plan at the 11th hour between the postal votes and the ballot box votes. I'm not sure what can be done about that. I think that might be a slap on the wrist, but never mind, it's happened. I think from the point of view of the local plan itself, it's highly probable that the local plan will be JR'd, judicial review. Now, the judicial review process can be quite lengthy. And clearly the politicians who voted for the local plan voted for certainty now. That was at least part of the selling point. We didn't want to have no plan for an extended period. JR'ing the plan might leave us with no plan for a period. So I think there has to be some discussion about what the scope is for finding the plan unsound. And if the plan is partly unsound, can it be fixed? And if it can be fixed, can it be fixed quickly? I think the key part of that is it needs an independent review. So the QC that was advising Guildford Borough Council was employed by Guildford Borough Council to give them advice to get the plan adopted. We actually need to look at it from the other end of the telescope.
But a judicial review won't find the plan unsound, will it? It will just simply say that the process wasn't followed correctly.
Well, a judicial review, broadly speaking, and I'm not a lawyer, so forgive my lay interpretation, but a judicial review is really to establish whether it was rational, given all of the facts and under the circumstances, for that decision to have been made. And that could be at the inspector level and it could be at the council level. Okay,
thank you. Now, social housing, I think everyone agrees that more social housing in Guildford is required. But we haven't been very successful as a borough in building new council houses recently, and yet we have a waiting list of between 2,000 and 3,000, I believe. So what new ideas could you bring to the table on that problem?
So I think that there are a number of different aspects to this. One is, are there enough housing sites in the right place where people with social needs can actually be housed? And the most sustainable place for that would be in the town centre. So there needs to be more effort put in to establish locations and suitable sites in the town centre for that. I think the other elements of it, there need to be infrastructure that supports them. So if you're a young family and you've got children of primary school age, windfall housing in the town centre, whether it's developed by the council or by third parties, needs to have all of that infrastructure. So I think it's a holistic view of that. The other part of it is that the planning rules leave affordable housing pretty much at the end of the viability calculation. So after you've funded infrastructure, after you've funded various other contributions to SANG and so on and so forth, if there's enough money left over, you might provide some affordable housing. I think that's not going to change in a hurry, but it needs to. And I think what has to happen is the council needs to step in and invest in social housing.
But have you identified any sites where you could have social housing projects?
So the Guildford Vision Group, you mentioned that I was a part of that. Guildford Vision Group has provided a master plan of the town centre and identified space for about 3,500 homes in the town centre. Yeah. None of those is especially quick to deliver, and what we don't want to do is to deliver ghettos of social housing. It has to be part of an overall housing solution. But it can't be right that a scheme the size of Solent can only provide 10%.
Okay, so you would disperse the social housing amongst other housing projects?
I would look to follow the guidelines that have been drawn up by a number of organisations, including the likes of the Peabody Trust and so on.
And what about the funding? Because until recently, the government money wasn't available for these projects, but they have taken the cap off that. Do you think that that's now going to be available, that money?
Well, so if you look at what other local authorities have done investing in different property types, and Guildford have done it to a certain extent strategically, someone like Spelthorne, they're about £1.5 billion invested in commercial property. The purpose of doing that is to get a better return than their cost of funds. And actually social housing can provide a better return than the cost of funds for Guildford Borough Council. So it can be an effective investment medium, and it also helps to solve problems at the same time.
So you don't think either the problems of finding the sites or finding the money are intractable?
They're not intractable, but they are difficult. You've got to want to do it, and I think that the Lib Dems have said that that's their policy goal. R4GV set it out as a clear goal. So you've got a majority of councillors on the council who got elected to try and sort it out.
Okay, so let's move on to other policy areas then. Caroline Reeves, the new council leader, said that she wanted to tackle deprivation and homelessness with new approaches. Would you support that, and have you got any ideas to contribute?
So absolutely, we would support that. Those are initiatives that, if they're done right, will give a huge benefit socially, culturally and economically to Guildford and the region. I think one of the challenges that we have is that the council hasn't seemed to take note of the indices of multiple deprivation that are published every 5 years by the
Something
government.
you've written about?
Something that I put together a paper in 2014 as the Guildford Society response to the local plan. I reiterated it in 2017. I pointed out how there would be deprivation to some sectors of society by adopting the local plan. It's something I've felt very strongly about for a long time. There are a lot of answers that are in our midst. but identifying the problem is a key part of tackling deprivation.
Do you agree with me that in an affluent town like Guildford, we have an even greater duty to try and tackle these things?
Yes, absolutely. It may surprise you to know that in some aspects of deprivation, we're in the poorest 5% in the country of areas. And those are the sub-areas that account for about 1,000 or so people. But that's pretty terrible in Guildford.
Is the R4GP party sustainable? How are you going to make sure that people keep supporting it? In 4 years' time, there'll be another election. How will you tackle that?
I think that's a two-level answer. If you look at Epsom and Newell, that meeting we had in January, we had a councillor from Epsom and Newell explaining to us how they manage a resident-run council, and that's been going for nearly 90 years.
So this was your initiation meeting when you invited someone from...
Exactly, and part of that was to be able to explain and satisfy ourselves that what we were doing was rational and sensible. I think taking R4GV forward, we have to show that we've listened, we have to show that we're doing things, that we care. It is about that two-way connection with our residents. It's also about using any power and responsibility that we have wisely, compassionately and sensibly.
But Guildford, obviously your primary concern is for the residents of Guildford, but we're not an island. So how will you make sure that we play our part as a community, both within the county of Surrey and the country? So
the county of Surrey has quite a lot of resident groups now with good representation on the council. So Waverley has quite a lot in Farnham area. Tandridge, another area that one of the councillors there, the leader for Oxted residents, came and talked to us. And those groups, I think, are going to be getting together to pursue an inclusive agenda. The Local Government Association has an independent grouping there alongside its party groupings. So I think the mechanisms are there to be able to draw support and to help to influence. We have to change the way this is done. We have to change Surrey as well as Guildford to be more in touch with the people, to be delivering what the people need, and to be looking in all of the dark corners, all of the quiet areas for the people who need help and haven't reached out.
So will you be putting up candidates at the county council election?
I think it's quite likely. Obviously we need candidates to come forward, so watch this space, but it will be an aspiration.
Julian Lyon, thank you very much.
Thank you.